want to talk about, Sean? Let's start the conversation. Keep it going, man.
The one thing that I think happens is a topic for many countries throughout Europe is what are your thoughts on how to create parity within national leagues around Europe?
Creating the parity again. I mean, we beat it over the head about the import situation earlier, but I would think having either a financial salary cap on imports would be a really good idea. That way, teams don't spend all their resources on players and coaches instead of developing players. Putting that money into using the youth. A lot of teams, their budgets are okay. We have this much to spend on imports so that we can compete, and then whatever is left, we're going to spend that on our players and our youth program. Well, if we can, limit that top end, like if we get a 20,000 euro sponsor, instead of us saying, oh, well, now we can afford better imports, how about, well, we only can use a certain amount of that anyways. The rest is going to go to our team, which means over time, we're going to have better players because we're going to be able to get better equipment. We're going to be able to put more into coaching camps for our juniors. And eventually, we're going to get to the point where we can compete without going through our whole budget on import players. I think another thing that will help with the parity is for leagues to limit the amount of teams allowed to play. Obviously, it's not a big deal in certain countries, but I live in Finland, so this is what I'm watching. And here in Finland, there's over 40 men's teams. And on average, they have about 20 players. That's not a lot of players to play American football an entire season, yet there's so many options that players are changing teams locally. I'm not even talking about imports. I'm talking about domestic players. They're changing teams like they're changing underwear. You got guys who every year they're playing on a different team. I met a guy, he played his rookie season in one city. His second year changed teams. He's been playing football for 3 years on 3 different teams. He has not learned anything similar in those 3 years. And for that reason, he's an average player. His ceiling is kind of limited because there's no continuity between him learning from a system that works for him. He's just going to wherever the trend is. Now, you have some countries out here, like I'm talking to Sweden. I spent a lot of time there last year. League only has 5 teams. And looking from the outside in, you see 5 teams, you're like, okay, the league must not be good. In that league, you had the Karlstad Crusaders, who were considered a top 10 in Europe and played internationally and actually were very competitive internationally, losing the championship in the NFL by 1 point. They come into the playoffs in Sweden. They played a 4th ranked team in Sweden. And this team has only won 3 games in the entire season in a 6-team league. They only beat that team by a few points in the playoffs because that team, despite their record of losing in that league, they were losing against good competition. And they, even in the losses they had, they were close. So even in the playoffs, the Crusaders beat the Uppsala 86ers, I think is the name, or 89ers. Damn it, I can't remember the name of that
I think
team.
it's 86ers.
Is it 86? 86ers. The Crusaders beat Uppsala 50-43. They had never gave up that many points to that team during the regular season, but in that matchup, they had played each other so many times that they were able to play at a higher level. In the championship, the Crusaders lost to the Mean Machines 42-41. Like it was the upset of the year in Europe, and in a championship game, dethroning the reigning kings. And the reason for that is that despite there only being 5 teams, those 5 teams were competitive. Matter of fact, that Uppsala team actually tied the last place team for that playoff spot and won by point differential. Like that's how close things were in the league. And something like that is what you don't see in a lot of leagues. You don't see a lot of number 4 teams playing against number 1 and taking them to the brink in the playoffs. Even in the GFL, they had some great playoff games this year that led to a championship, the second consecutive championship game won by less than 3 points. It's awesome for them, but that's not the norm in Europe. A lot of teams, a lot of leagues, you can look at the league and be like, okay, this team is going to win. This team is going to be in second or maybe upset the winner. And then you got a whole bunch of going on. Like, look at the Helsinki Roosters. They breezed through the Maple League this year. Competition just wasn't up to snuff in that league. And it had a lot to do with the fact that the different teams have different priorities, and finances play a huge part in those priorities. People are spending their money on certain things to get certain situations accomplished, and it really just creates a gap in competition on the field. And this happens because there's so many options. There's so many places for teams to go, so many places for people to get money and to create different resources that it creates that disparity. It's similar to an economy of any country. You know, you have the rich, you have the middle class, and you have the poor. But in this sport, because of the I want to say because of the changing climate constantly, you have a lot of rich and a lot of poor, and the middle class is not being made as normally to the level that we would want to create that parity between the leagues. You're not getting a lot of middle of the road teams who are good every year, or maybe great, or maybe have a little bit of a down but get back to it. You have teams that are remaining great, and you have teams that are remaining horrible and then jumping up and then dropping back down. You don't have teams who are saying, you know what, we're going to make playoffs every year and we're going to compete. You have teams saying, we're going to make playoffs, we're going to compete, we're going to put all our money in, and then next year we're going to suck. And that's a lot to do with the financial responsibilities of the teams. And I think putting like a cap or a budget on either imports or player salaries, or even how much you can spend on a year for team budgets, would help create that parity that, you know, we'd have more people being fiscally responsible and stay and towing the line in the middle instead of going one way or the other.
So your bullet points are kind of minimize the amount of teams, salary cap, and not so many transfers within it. So like, for instance, Finland is a great example of lack of parity, right? The Roosters are on 8 champions.
7. They won 7.
Oh, excuse me. I don't want to give them more than what they already have. All right. Even though they deserve it, they're a great club. But the reason they're a great club is they've kind of swallowed clubs, right? When clubs falter in Finland, for example, early in their run, the Wolverines. Oh no, excuse me. Was it the Wolverines? Yeah, the Wolverines. No, but it was the Wolverines in like 2013, and the club. Yeah, and then all those players joined the Roosters. I played for the several of them, right?
Yeah, there's 5 teams in the Helsinki area, and usually when players leave those teams, they go to the Roosters.
Exactly, but there's only one in the, at least when I was playing there, there's only one Helsinki team in the Maple League. When I started, there was 3.
There's 2 now.
Okay, good.
3. There's 5 teams in the area.
But the Roosters are swallowing clubs. Right? I played for Turku. A lot of those Turku guys are now playing for the Roosters. You know what I mean? So the reason being is they're a great club with great management. They know what they're doing. They attract good players, right? But to counter that, one of the leagues that I think has the most parity in Europe is France, from a national champion standpoint, right? Yeah. They rotate every 2 or 3 years who's in. I think Flash was last year. Cougars had a run. The Tonan had a run there for a little bit, but it's 2 or 3 years, which is different than most leagues. You know, most leagues, you have a stretch of even longer of clubs dominating. So France has one of the biggest parities within one of the major leagues in Europe, but they also have transfer rules. You can't assume that many players from different clubs on a given year. You have a fixed number. I forget what that number is, but you have a fixed number, right? And I think part of that is the semi-pro versus, so your example of the guy who played for 3 different clubs in 3 different years, that's unheard of in an amateur structure, right? Because you're being developed. Right? There's nobody in Austria who switches clubs. Very rarely, unless you're studying, you're from Innsbruck and you're going to study in Vienna or vice versa. University makes you change clubs, not because you're playing. Some in Vienna, obviously, it's a little bit more because you have some clubs close together and there's academy or whatever. But once you get to the men's level, you do not have players switching clubs. You don't see that very often. Where in other leagues, it's very, very common. But it's very, very common in the semi-pro leagues. So I think even in those leagues having some type of transfer policy, which I think Germany does have, that would help. But I think the bigger thing is and I think what you would ask most people, what's most important about a club in any given league, and you can point to the national championship, the national champions, or the guys who are always competing. It's always money, right? That's the thing that people always say. I need money, and that's how I can build this club in many different aspects, right? But the thing that I think is interesting and what I would like to see more of is national federations being more involved with their clubs. The clubs that have money also have good management. Those things are a positive correlation. You don't have a club with bad management that has a huge bank account, a huge budget every year. It doesn't happen because a club needs to have good management to not only attract money, but also spend that money wisely, keep sponsors, and keep building that budget and building what you're doing every given year. If a club doesn't know how to do that, even if you have a spike one year, like you said, maybe the next year they go from 100 to 20 because they don't know how to do it, they lose the sponsorship or whatever the case may be. So there's a positive correlation with teams that have money and teams that have good management. So what I would like to see is federations being more involved with the management of clubs. Go in and have one person, one employee that is a sports management expert, and they go in and tutor these clubs on how to acquire proper sponsors, right? How to keep these sponsors, how to budget, right? Because you have these clubs, sometimes they're not run by business people. Sometimes they're not run by people who are in that realm of the world. You know,
Exactly.
they're just people that are passionate about the sport and they want to help develop it. But give them the tools, give them the information to be able to do that. And I think it's a big disadvantage for federations, especially when clubs have to pay this federation to be a part of it, right? To be in part of these leagues. I think that could be something small that a federation gives back to clubs, and just have one guy travel from club to club and teach them how to use money, and teach them how to gain sponsors, keep sponsors, budget wisely, what to prioritize within your budget. And it's not always imports. It's not. You have to build a stable foundation. You know what I mean? Like, for example, what I know intimately, the Raiders didn't become the Raiders overnight. The Raiders didn't get Swarco because they were a terrible organization and they were saved. You know what I mean? Positivity or successful people attract successful people. You have to know what you're doing, or you're just going to be a flash in the pan. To have sustained success, you have to have great management. And that's the biggest thing about the Roosters. They have guys in place, guys and women in place, knowing what they're doing and doing a great job at it in comparison to the rest of the clubs in the country. So if you're a good football player, you're going to go to these clubs because you want to. You want to play for the best organization you can. So to empower and piggybacking off you, if you cut club size or the amount of clubs down, and then teach them how to be good clubs on the management side, which I think is so overlooked, you're going to start getting better clubs and better competition. And I would love to see I don't know any federation that does that. I would love to see federations be more hands-on in these clubs, especially in the sports management field, because it seems like a lot of clubs are out there doing their best, but they don't have the tools to be successful.
Man, I love how you said that, because I feel like that's exactly what needs to be done. The federations kind of jumping into it and helping the teams. Speaking here in Finland, I don't know if you're aware, but last season the league was supposed to have 7 teams, but one team pulled out about a month before the season started. Yeah. And that was really due to not being prepared. The team couldn't get a head coach. They couldn't lock in sponsors. They had financial issues. They didn't have any juniors to fill the roster. They had to get imports to fill their roster to be able to play in the season. And they weren't able to do it, and they just had to call it. Well, that's something that as a federation, a national federation, you should see coming. You should be able to curb that. Like, there should be policies in place, like you said, having someone being able to help a team manage their money, their budget, and having their 5-year plan. If a team folds, one, it shouldn't be on a seasonal basis. Like, you should know in advance if a team isn't going to make it. There should be some rules in place saying, hey, you guys haven't had a juniors team in the last 4 years. How are you going to continue to have domestic players? But I feel in certain countries, and obviously I'm speaking a lot of experience from here in Finland, That's not the case. You got teams who are 1 year we have 100 players, 1 year we only have 20, and we're just rolling with the punches every year. Or you have teams who, okay, we have a decent men's team for this age period, this generation, because we had juniors come up, but we didn't put more effort into our next crop of juniors.
Right.
We actually have a team here, the Sinioki Crocodiles. Sorry to put you out like this, guys, but they had a bad season last year for the first time in who knows how long. And it wasn't because, oh, the organization is not good or they're not ready. They had a generational gap. They had players who on that team were either 18 years old or 27, and
Yeah.
very few in between that age. Meaning there was a period where their juniors didn't stay within the organization. And for the last 3 years, their U17, U15, U19 teams have been killing it in Finland. And in the next 3 or 4 years, they're going to be back on top. But the thing is, that huge drop they had in that 1 year increased. That's what made it such a difference between the best and worst team in Finland. Because for this generation, they didn't have the players they needed, and they didn't see it coming until it was too late. And this is something that, as a federation, you need to be able to step in and say, if you guys aren't fielding a juniors team during these years, then you're going to have this period. And we see this coming, and we're going to enforce or help you figure out how to make sure your juniors are constantly rotating into your men's league, making sure that when you spend money on imports, you don't ruin your budget for your 5-year plan or your 10-year plan. Stuff like that. Like you mentioned, the Helsinki Roosters, they have a plan. They have a lot of big things coming up in the future. That type of organizational structure is what needs to be transferred to every team on a national level. You
And that
need
needs to be the norm.
exactly that needs to be the norm. You need some way to either enforce policies or create policies or standards that the league can make sure that all the teams are developing. If everyone is developing, the product on the field is going to show it. And what it's going to show is that these organizations are getting quality players, developing quality players, keeping quality players, attracting quality imports, and it all plays a part in it. But like you said, I'm really changing my view here. Originally I was thinking, it's all about the money, but really I think accountability by the federations is what's needed to make that parity increase on a national scale.
I think so, because the federations control everything that you talked about, right? They can control transfer policies. They can control the amount of clubs within a given league or a set league within your nation. And like I said, I think the most important thing is being involved in the clubs. And I think there are federations, especially Austria, they are involved in the football side, but I would love to see them more involved in the management side and showing these guys who are not professionals in sports management and teach them how to be, and teach them how to be more professional, and teach them how to run a sustainable club. And it's not always the football side. It's the management side as well that's so important. And that's when you get great clubs, is when you have people who know what to do on the football side and people who know what to do on the management side, and it's a great marriage. But oftentimes it's not enough on the management side, in my opinion, and I think that would help parity as well.